Russia is something that you have quite a bit of experience with, thoughts on. We've talked about over the last couple of days, Nick and I, with our guests, about election security challenges that Russia is posing around the world, about the disinformation campaigns that Russia is very effectively carrying out around the world, about some of the more aggressive behaviors as well with assassinations, which Nick has dealt with within the UK. So why don't we stick to that for just a few minutes and start off with some of the ideas that you've talked about earlier this year with a session at the Cipher brief for our members on some ideas specifically on the disinformation campaigns. So let me just give you a moment to set the stage about the challenge and then some of the ideas that you have in addressing that.
Well, thanks, Suzanne, and Nick, it's good to be with you as well. Of course, my comeuppance, I guess, was the election of 2016, and as we all know, the Russians particularly have a long history of interfering in elections, theirs and other people's, and we have records certainly in this country going back Cold War days of the Russians attempting, often pretty obvious, unsophisticated, and ham-handed to attempt to influence through money or whatever the outcome of an election. But never, ever on the scale, aggressiveness, and breadth and depth of what they did in the run-up to the election in 2016. I've never seen anything like it. And as I've said, I think to you, Suzanne, and others, in my 50 years, whatever, in intelligence, I've seen a lot of bad stuff, but nothing that approached how disturbing this was viscerally to me when I came to understand the magnitude of what the Russians were trying to do. Now, the difference, of course, is in the application of technologies, notably social media. And the Russians, who do have a very sophisticated understanding of our political landscape, deliberately exploited the polarization and divisiveness in this country. And they had messages for everybody. Black Lives Matter, white supremacists, anti-Nazi, pro-Nazi, anti-Muslim, any aggrieved group in our country, they directed messages for. And of course, their objective here was to sow doubt, discord, distrust, and they were eminently successful. And of course that continues. And as a backdrop to this, what makes this so serious is what the Rand Corporation has cleverly and aptly called truth decay in this country, which is the dissing of fact, truth, empirical evidence, etc. And so, and this is something that didn't start with Donald Trump. This existed in this country long before his arrival on the political scene. He just exploited it, amplified it, and accelerated it. And now we have the situation in this country today where we have essentially two camps, each in their own reality bubble, and who can agree on basic truths, which is extremely dangerous to our democracy or any democracy. If you don't have the foundation of agreement on what is fact, what is true, it's very difficult to sustain a democracy. So that's why this is, to me, a very serious problem. Well, what to do about it? Well, this is not just a whole of government challenge. This is a whole of society challenge. And with respect to society, both my offspring and their spouses were educators, elementary and high school. And so I believe first, and this is a long-term solution, that kids in school need to be taught something about critical analysis, questioning what they see, learn to question what they see, read, and hear on the internet, for example. And that needs to start no later than middle school in this country. Now, that's a long-term solution. But I just cite that as an example of a societal challenge. In the government, there are things that can be done. And I'll focus specifically on what the intelligence community might do. And again, this is not a panacea. This is not going to cure world hunger when it comes to mis or disinformation, but it's another arrow in the quiver, so to speak, that could be employed. What I specifically am referring to is an outside the wire open source center that's fairly robustly resourced. And by outside the wire, what I'm trying to suggest there is the obverse of what open source has traditionally been, the way it's traditionally been treated and used in the US intelligence community, which is a supplement, complement, or a support source for the classified world. What I'm suggesting is the opposite of that. An outside the wire, meaning not in a classified facility, open source center, which would be supported, buttressed, amplified by classified information. Now, this would serve a number of purposes. One of which would be, in our case, with whatever it is, big number, $80 billion that the US taxpayers fork out every year for intelligence, so that individual citizens could derive value added from the huge investment that the United States makes in intelligence every year. So citizens could derive benefit from a part of the intelligence community. And what I had in mind is, I think global trends, which is the future projection that the U.S. Intelligence Committee issues, every 4 years or so. A new one just came out here recently, which I think is a superb document. Well, there ought to be more of that. So it isn't just a one-off every 4 years or anecdotally. There should be a steady stream of this, supported by intelligence, have an organization that can do the pull function. By that, I mean classified reporting, analysis and reporting that could be declassified, and much of it could be, that would have great utility. And this would be one more weapon that could be used to fight the dis and misinformation war. And as well, in our case, a place you could hire new people while they're waiting a clearance, which is always a challenge in this country, even though there have been big strides made in clearance reform, or for people that for legitimate reasons just can't be cleared. And this could also address any number of other issues which are heavily reliant on open source information. And I'm thinking of climate change, for example. And this could be a source of information for citizens about climate change. And it could serve, again, as a fact checker, one of a number. And of course, yeah, it's the government, so people be suspicious of it, okay. But at least the intelligence community would be part of this fight. And it is, in my view, a fight for the survival of our democracy.
I love the idea of the intelligence community taking what they gather and sharing appropriately more of it with the public to help them sort of sort through. And I think you're right on the issue of analytic thinking. I will yield to Nick if Nick has a question, but I do want to ask if this is something Avril Haines has, that the new DNI has inherited this problem. Do you have any idea, Jim, if this is something that is on the table?
Well, I've, one of the great things about being out of the government, you're not responsible anymore. You can kibitz and pick up great ideas, and you don't have the burden of implementing them. And so, I talked to the intelligence transition team about it, and I've certainly had direct dialogue with her about it. She has established a center that I think gets at malign influence, foreign influence, which I think that certainly would be one part of this. I had something perhaps more grandiose in mind than that. But that's an indicator of a harbinger, I'll put it that way, of what what could be the basis for a larger center. But believe me, I am very sympathetic to Abril's situation, having sat in that chair for 6.5 years myself. And lots of people got great ideas, and from a resource standpoint, it's kind of zero sum. She's not going to get some boon, presentation of, well, here's 500 billets you can have, so go organize an open source center. It doesn't work that way. And so if you're going to do something new, you have to figure out something old that you're going to quit doing, and that's hard. So it's not that she's not supportive, she is. She understands the idea, but implementing, that's another issue.
Making it work within the system she's leading now is not as easy. Totally understandable. Actually, I have a question for both of you. So, and this is kind of leaning more into policy. We talk about the Russia problem on a broader level. When we talk about election interference and hacking and looking the other way when criminal groups launch attacks or launching your own attacks, such as in SolarWinds or assassinations, are we simply playing whack-a-mole? And as I mentioned, this goes into the policy area, but there has to be more that can be done, given that everybody has sort of described the Russia issue as an irritant, one that is President Putin is very successful with a lot of the strategies with causing disruption. But is it a whack-a-mole game? And on a broader level, how can alliances come together to administer more pressure to make some of these activities stop? And both of you, I'd like to hear from both of you on it. Sorry, Nick.
Nick, over to you.
Well, I suppose the question that's on my mind is interference in elections has become a much bigger deal than it was when I was younger. And more resources are devoted to this, more technological capability goes in behind it, and the strategic impact of that is significant. And Jim was talking about the 2016 US elections. That really did scare me to see what was happening then. I also worry a bit about whether people understand the threat. I mean, I was at a separate discussion recently when a French political analyst was talking about the upcoming French presidential elections, and I asked about how worried this person was about Russian influence in the French presidential elections. And I'm pretty sure the candidate the Russians want to win is not President Macron. However, occasionally ambivalent Macron's approach to Russia has been. I'm pretty clear the Russians want somebody else to win. And so I was asking, are they worried about that? And the response was, well, the Russians have probably only got the capability to affect the result by 2 to 3%. And I thought, well, that turns the election, doesn't it? 2 to 3% is massive. Why are you not really terrified of that? So I guess I wonder whether we're almost becoming immune to the ability of hostile powers, particularly the Russians, but I'm sure the Chinese as well, to interfere with our democratic processes. And people are getting resigned to it, and it's going to get built into what we accept. So I suppose what I'm thinking about in terms of where do intelligence and security services come into this? And I'd be interested in what Jim thinks about this, because it seems to me that one thing that intelligence services can do is bang to rights conspiracies by foreign agencies to fiddle our election results and enable politicians to expose them and put pressure on them. But what do you think, Jim?
Well, I agree. I think, the challenge is how do you achieve the psychology of deterrence in the mind of an adversary? And we have struggled mightily with that in the cyber realm, for example. I mean, let's say, for the sake of discussion, the interference with election is a part of that domain. Information operations or information campaigns, whatever you want to call them. And the Russians particularly, in fact, and of course, others have watched the Russian playbook And now we have more other countries playing besides the Russians, who to me are the masters at it. And as long as they can push the envelope as they have without, a lot of damage, they're going to keep doing it. So, and this pipeline seizure by a alleged criminal group in Russia. Well, it's kind of hard for me to believe that the Russian government certainly witting, if not encouraging or sanctioning something like that. Well, under any other circumstance, this would be an act of war. But since it's cyber, well, you can't see, feel, or touch it, so it isn't quite an act of war. Well, this is insidious. It really is. And one of the problems I saw during the Obama administration is if you're going to retaliate, let's say you're going to counter retaliate against an attack in whatever form it takes, whether it's interference with an election or seizing a pipeline, and you're going to retaliate in kind. Well, the problem is, and this is a challenge for intelligence officers, is what will the counter retaliation be? And unless you know that, and unless as an intelligence officer, you can state to the policymaker, if you take this action, if you counter retaliate, this is what will occur. And then are you able to absorb and be resilient for a counter retaliation, the magnitude of which you don't know what it'll be. So this is the dilemma that you get into. And so what we've traditionally done is resort to another form of pressure, sanctions. And I think we have a bad case of sanction fatigue these days. And the track record hadn't been very effective.
Yeah. And when does the cost
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, when does the cost of not doing anything, how do you know when that outweighs the potential
Exactly. The cost is more.
Right.
You're going to incur more. And of course, anyone who's been a casual observer, it comes as no surprise that our critical infrastructure has been attacked and part of it seized. Now, you can go through the legality, the niceties. Well, it wasn't a Russian government entity. Well, the Internet Research Agency wasn't a government entity either, but it was certainly influenced, controlled, directed. So,
and this is a new trend that we've been hearing about. I spoke a few months back with the Assistant Attorney General for National Security here in the U.S., who said there was a growing, very concerning trend that nation states, i.e. Russia and China, are turning a blind eye when convenient to these criminal organizations, sometimes sharing profits with these criminal organizations. So then when does a government treat a criminal organization as if it is, in fact, connected to a nation state? I think that's going to be a question that we're going to be asking ourselves a lot more in the coming year.
Yeah, you could certainly make the case that if this organization is known to the Russian government, that the Russian government should do something about it. Well, what it's doing is acquiescing in its behavior, and this is all very insidious.
Yeah.
And every time we have another event like this, and the threshold is raised for what is apparently acceptable, then that just encourages people, whether it's nation state or non-nation state entities, to do more.
There were criticisms, and let me just ask this, and then I'm going to be quiet and let Nick ask any questions before we ask you for your final thoughts on this, Jim. But there was criticism of the Obama administration that there was too much fear and too much caution, and there's been a lot of eyes on a Biden administration to see if maybe they would take a different tack when it comes to these cyber attacks. What would you hope to see come from the Biden administration as it continues to get its cyber team in place? But what would you hope to see happen as a response to this gas pipeline?
Well, this is a cliche, but there needs to be much more and deeper information sharing between the private sector and the government. Now, in fairness, there are inhibitions in both camps for doing that. You know, there are proprietary corporate concerns on the part of the private sector, and of course the government has the classic, you know, concern about protecting sources and methods and tradecraft, et cetera. And but I do think there needs to be an obligation on the part of private sector that, you know, without penalty, if that's possible, that it's mandatory that they report. I think there should be a set of standards that private sector, cybersecurity standards that private sector must adhere to. And, you know, if they don't, well, they don't do business with the government, for example. You know, you have to think through the legalities of all that. But we clearly need to, you know, we need to buttress our defense. That's for sure. And we certainly have the offensive tools where we could do a lot of damage. But again, the inhibitor there is, okay, if you do that, what will the counter retaliation be? And that then you get into a real difficult minefield.
Yeah, agreed. Nick, anything top of mind? If not, I have another surprise guest.
Oh, well, let's see the surprise guest then.
So this was not planned. I just want everyone to know, but the level of conversation, I think, is so excellent that some of our future speakers are wanting to get involved. So I'd like to welcome in Norm Rule. Norm is the former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and as such has been a leading expert during his time in government, leading sort of intelligence policy decisions, giving that intelligence. And Norm, if you want to go ahead, and I see that Brad, help me out. I see that his camera and microphone are on, but I'm not seeing him on screen. We'll bring him in just a moment here. We'll get this nailed down. I believe he has a question for this as well. Let me just bring in one more question. Ken Dekleva, Ken is joining us. He is a former psychiatrist with the State Department and is in private practice now. Ken says, isn't it the case that host governments like China and Russia are responsible for the threat actors? I think this is what we were just touching on. He says it's similar to the logic that was used by President Bush in the war on terror. I do think Ken's point is that there are, you know, times in history when adversaries, criminal groups were treated as sort of extensions by nation states.
Is that for me?
I was going to say, I mean, it's a question, but it's one that I think we've just addressed, you know, in how we tackle this. And we're trying to get Norm sorted here so we can join us.
Suzanne, if I understood the question correctly, is the degree of proven connection between a nation state government and a non-nation state entity that's doing something nefarious? Is that the question?
I think that's correct. I think that's how I'm reading it, Ken. Forgive me.
Well, that's a problem, because from a legal standpoint, if you get the lawyers involved, you know, they want to see some courtroom admissible evidence of a connection. Well, that's kind of hard to prove sometimes. And at least that's my experience. And yeah, I've heard the criticism that Obama administration was too cautious and too careful and all that. And yeah, maybe so. You know, another issue comes up that you know, poses challenges legally is if you if you want to attack nation X, but you have to go through nation Y's infrastructure in order to attack your target, country X, well, is that a act of war against country Y if you're using their infrastructure to attack another nation state? Well, that, you know, the lawyers will argue for hours about that.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think that's a question that's also going to come up more as you see criminal groups who are embedded in sovereign nations, which aren't addressing the issue. We dealt with this with bin Laden, right?
At least visible to me is the magnificent Norm Rule. So,
Yes.
so
Welcome,
please,
Norm.
who today has a tie on. You know, when he zooms with me, he doesn't put a tie on, so I know where I stand with Norm. Anyway, Norm, good to see you.
Jim, you raised the great question of how these non-official entities are now being used by governments to conduct activities, which in the past would be state actions. You see this with Iran, with its proxies. You see this with its cyber actions around the world. Is it time for international law to be changed? Is there not just a vast weakness in the international security community where we are not capable of addressing these actions?
Yeah, Norm, you raise a great point, and what you're getting at, I think, is kind of crucial, because until such time as we have international norms, no pun intended, about cyber behavior, and the three key entities that have got to sign up to those norms are Russia, China, and the United States, and we haven't reached that point yet. You know, I often compare where we are now in this realm to the historical evolution of the law of the sea, which took, you know, hundreds of years to evolve. And most seafaring nations now abide by the law of the sea. Well, in comparative historical progression, we're at a very early stage, and with respect, I think, with respect to cyber. And we're not, it's still the Wild West, if you will. A lot of pirates out there in the broad ocean area.
That's a great point. Jim, let me ask you for any closing thoughts. And Norm, just come on back in and stick around with us, because we're going to come right back to you in just a moment. And any closing thoughts, Jim, on this sort of issue of disinformation, election interference, all these very significant
Well, we now know how other countries are exploiting us, starting with Russia, and others have gotten on that bandwagon. You know, they've read the playbook. So you have China, Iran, North Korea, you know, different capability, lesser capability, I think, and different agendas often. So that's point one. There's a huge threat out there because of the jeopardy to our democracy and of course, as we've seen, Russia exploits, you know, the situation that exists there already. There are things we can do about it, both short-term, long-term, and to fight what the Rand Corporation, I think, as I said, cleverly and aptly calls truth decay. And this is a whole society thing. I cited the example of, you know, there's education that needs to happen. Kids need to be taught what we would recognize as critical thinking, to question what they see, read, and hear on the internet. And there's things the government can do. The point is, there's no one silver bullet.
I think that's a great point. And it's not just kids that need to be taught how to question the sources of what they're reading on the internet. Unfortunately, it's some of us folks in the older category as well. Jim Clapper, thank you so much for just contributing so richly to this conversation across a number of issues today. We very much appreciate having you with us.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.